Now, to start off with this, we have to really think about when does history begin, right? And that might seem obvious, but it's actually quite a complex question. Does it, is it at the beginning of the universe, right, with the Big Bang? Is it, is it at the evolution of life, like kind of like the genesis of life? Is it when humans first evolved out of out of like kind of apes? Like when is it when we had the first civilization? When does history actually start? Is it the first time that someone wrote down an event and said this happened before, or is it the first time someone told a story about something that happened, right? Because history, there is no, it's quite difficult to say when there's a starting point, when there's an end point, right? But for the sake of this video, we'll just talk briefly about the history of human beings, right? So human beings arose out of Africa, we believe around 200,000 years ago, and so our ancestors, the evolution of grass is actually quite well correlated with the development of like early humanoids, right? So you had before about like 7 million years ago or thereabouts, right? In Africa, where our species originated from, you had huge forest lands, right? That covered most of the continent, right? And then around that time, you started to have a drier, you started to have like a drier climate, right? And what ended up happening is that the forest ended up shrinking, and a relatively new plant type called grass started to arise, right? So the grasslands end up pushing the forest back further and further. And so our ancestors were up in the trees, and when they were looking about for food, bit by bit they have to, forage around in the grasslands, right? Or if they had to go from one bit of forest to the next, they had to cross that. And you can see this with chimps today, right? Having to cross the grasslands of the savannah. Obviously, doing this poses a great lot of risk, right? If you're going about on your hands and feet, you are not able to see as many things. You're not able to see that lion that's like kind of hiding in the grass, like kind of, you know what I mean? Like you're not able to see the elephant that's over there. So standing on our hind legs, being bipedal, as it's saying, that was a massive like help to us, right? And so the early humanoids basically started to develop and become more and more upright and more, using tools and using different things to kind of like, to get food so over time ended up evolving into many different species, the Homo erectus, like kind of, and all these other like kind of species and stuff, right? And eventually we get to a point around 200,000 years ago where human beings, Homo sapiens sapiens, like as they're referred to, started to develop around East Africa. Probably we expect somewhere around Lake Victoria, so kind of like Uganda, Kenya, like those kind of places, right? So with those early humans, they then bit by bit started spreading out, and this was looking for food, like kind of fleeing from warring tribes, this sort of thing, right? And bit by bit, over hundreds of thousands of years, humans spread out. We believe from Africa, well, they spread around to the rest of Africa. Then we believe that they crossed over into the Arabian Peninsula, came up through that way, and went into Europe, went into Asia, crossed the Bering Strait, so the little gap between Siberia and Alaska, and that's how they believe people got to the Americas. And then going all the way around India and to the Southeast Asia and all those places, and like all the way to Australia, and then people setting out little like rafts and stuff and exploring the Pacific, right? So that's basically how human beings spread across the world, right? But for the vast majority of our existence, right? So you think about 200,000 years, right? Civilization, as we can think about it, only began about 9,000 years ago, right? So you're talking about the vast majority of human existence, yeah, was just hunter-gatherer, hunter-gatherer, hunter-gatherer. You know, you're looking for berries, you finding something, like you finding an animal, killing it, etc., etc., right? So this is how we lived for the vast majority of our time, right? And then around 9,000 years ago, people started to do agriculture, right? And that's we look at agriculture now and think that that makes sense, right? But the amount of foresight and the amount of risk taking it takes to be like, right, I'm going to plant these seeds, and in a few months' time, they will develop food and stuff, right? This is something which, you know, a lot of animals don't think this far ahead, right? So a wolf, for instance, when it has food, it will just gorge an entire, you know, like kilos and kilos of meat and stuff because it doesn't know the next time it's going to have food. So it doesn't think, oh, let me eat a bit now and save some for later, right? But human beings have that kind of innate ability to do long-term planning, and that's really essential. Like being like, I could eat these seeds now, or I could plant them and grow them for later, right? That is really innovative, and this basically was the development of agriculture. Now, with the development of agriculture, you started to see, you started to see more settled places, right? You started to get early sort of things of like, right, this is, rather than us just being nomads and going from one place to the next and just looking for food, it started to be a bit more like territorial and a bit more like, well, this is our land, this is where we grow our plant stuff, right? And we need to defend things from being robbed, so especially because not everyone all of a sudden just decided let's start farming and stuff, right? So you still had people who are, you know, going from one place to another and stuff, yeah, like kind of those kind of people needed to be defended against, right? So you needed to start, you know, and this is where people started to build little villages, little towns, and as a kind of defensive mechanism to be like, right, this is our little community, and we're defending against like people who are just wandering about, like kind of like trying to take things from us, right? And it's how we start seeing the development of like the early civilization and stuff, and you see it in particular in the Middle East, in what's known as Mesopotamia. So Mesopotamia means the place between two rivers, yeah. So the Tigris and the Euphrates. This is modern day Iraq. This is the cradle of civilization as such, right? So, and you start to completely independently of each other, right? You start to see places in China develop. You start to see places in Egypt, all the kind of places that have like regular rivers that are navigable, which means that boats can go along it. So if there's like huge like water rapids and etc., then it's not helpful. If you've got like calm water that floods regularly and you can kind of predict it and stuff, yeah, that makes a very easy way of developing crops and stuff, right? So you see this in the Indus Valley in Pakistan, in modern day Pakistan. You see it in many different places like around the world, right? And this is essentially how people started building up until eventually you get to the state where you have empires and war, you know, and the war, you know, the technology that comes from war, the competition that comes from war has been a huge part of the development of people. Obviously, a lot of people have died from it, needless to say, but the struggle to outdo the next group of people and to outdo that has had huge impact on the development of human beings, right? And so that's kind of, you know, and then skip forward hundreds and hundreds of thousands, or like, well, skip forward thousands of years rather from that point. We then end up with, you know, so so we've had agriculture, you know, you've had the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, yeah, you start getting the Iron Age, and, you know, again, the empires build bigger, you start having like ancient Greece, Persia, Rome, ancient China, all these kind of places, right? And then the next kind of thing we can really think of, and again, this skips over hundreds of years, right? Like hundreds and hundreds of years, right? We get to a point where human society had pretty much kind of, existed similarly in a fundamental sense. It kind of existed for the same. It obviously had changed over time, but there wasn't much of a difference in terms of. So someone living in 1700, like an ordinary person, and someone living in perhaps Roman times, yeah, obviously things would have been very like different in some ways, but the general way of their life, yeah, like being small farmers, maybe being small like traders or whatever, it's like very small and very primitive essentially, right? And all of a sudden you start to have, the agricultural revolution, right? And with that agricultural revolution, you have the industrial revolution, and now all of a sudden people are flocking to the cities, yeah, and the population becomes a lot more urbanized. They become a lot more literate, so they're able to read and write, and the level of education, the emerging of different ideas, the innovation, the industry that comes with that and stuff, right? The ends up creating a huge expanse of wealth, like the likes of which hadn't been, and the standards of ordinary people, although we all often think of like kind of Dickensian, like kind of, misery, like kind of like, people being poor, etc., etc. Actually, in contrast to how people lived in the countryside, these like factory workers, whatever, were far better off, right? That's why they didn't all go back to the countryside, because comparatively things were much better off. And as we've approached more modern times, it's a thing where the standard of living people has really risen to the point where ordinary people, like some of the poorest people in developed nations, live better than medieval kings and queens did. And it's, so this is kind of the broad kind of expansive history, but there's so much more with it as well. It's not just about technological, like kind of innovation and stuff. It's also about how we've developed our ideas over time, how we've developed our societies over time, and how we've kind of, well, for lack of a better word, how we've evolved as human, as like modern day man. And on top of all this, it's a thing of our, our history is, everything about how we live is shaped by our history, right? So I'm speaking to you now in English, right? That language 1,000 years ago was very different, almost in this, like, you almost couldn't like tell that they were the same languages, right? And how the English language has now developed is a thing where it's as a consequences of all the migrations and invasions and influences from different like other cultures and stuff over time. So the structure of our language is Germanic, right? So English is a Germanic language, but because of, for instance, the invasion of because of the invasion of the Romans and the Normans, we have a lot of influence from Latin and French, right? And like even the fact that our language is Germanic, that comes from the Anglo-Saxons, like kind of like invading after the fall of Rome and in between the invasion of the Normans, right? So even the very language that I'm speaking to you now is a product of all these different things, never mind all the different places that we've also explored, and like many different words have been borrowed from places that Britain conquered. So for instance, the word jungle derives from the Hindi word for jungly, which means wild. So so the word jungle essentially means like wild place kind of thing, right? You have pajamas, you have many different things, right? And this comes from the legacy of Britain being an imperial country and being in India, right? So many things that we kind of just take for granted and stuff, right? It's a thing of that, all of that is the product of history. Like, you wouldn't be here sat watching this YouTube video if it wasn't for you being the product of history. And the fact is as well that you are, every single one of your ancestors successfully lived long enough to reproduce and to pass on their genes stuff. And this goes all the way back from you now all the way to the very first life form, maybe like 3.5 billion years ago, right? So you wouldn't be here today were it not the product of a very extensive history that we have. We're nowhere near fully getting to the to the bare bones of, right? And so yeah, so that's essentially there's many other reasons why you should care about history, but the fact that you exist, it should be reason enough to care.